Witam wszystkich. Chciałbym zacząć od pokazania naszych sponsorów, więc przyjrzyjcie się, zapamiętajcie, są miłe stoiska w korytarzach, do których możecie podejść i pogadać z nimi, ale zgaduję, że drugiego dnia już to wiecie. I przejdziemy dalej. So, is there anybody in the room that doesn't speak Polish? Okay, so the topic today is about Fabric CICD. So about different approaches, what we can do, how we can do that, and what we probably shouldn't do. And the session in general will be in English. But if for any reason you don't feel comfortable asking in English your questions that you might have during the session, then just feel free to ask them in Polish. We'll translate them and answer them and so on. And the same goes, of course, for the chat. So is that okay with anybody? And of course, if you have questions during the prelection, then just interrupt me. Feel free to do so. Perfect. So why would you listen to me? So I'm Tomasz Mazurek. I've been working in data and Azure Cloud for the last 8 years. And I've been working in different projects regarding the usage of data on Azure in general. So usually I would build a platform first, so set up the infrastructure, networking, all the CI/CD pipelines, and then start working on that in regards with data projects, so lakehouses, data warehousing, reporting, integrations, and so on. And I've been doing that for the last 8 years. And now we have Fabric, and we are going to talk about what we can do in regards to the CI/CD there. So, what are we going to touch upon today? We're going to have a short intro about Fabric in general. I'm not going to dive deep into that because I assume you guys at least tried it once or so, a demo or something. But I'm going to talk about the changes that happened between the call for papers and this day, so for the last 6 months, because the tools available, the approaches were completely different back in December and are different today. So we're going to talk about that with some dates. Then we're going to talk about the default approach, so the deployment pipelines that were ported from Power BI to Fabric. Then we are going to have a short intrusion about how to do your Fabric workspaces and how to do your developer workflow. And I will point you to some really nice articles there about that too, for some deeper reading. And then, I might be showing that. So then there are 2 more tools that's shown in the last few months, which is Terraform and Fabric CICD, which is a Python library also done by Microsoft. And then for the last, I think, 2 or 3 slides, we're going to talk about what my view on that is, what your view is, and how you approach that in your projects. So, are there any questions at this point, or can we move forward? Perfect. So, Fabric is in GA from November 23. So basically a year and a half. So you would assume that this is a mature product that doesn't have changes that often. But the reality of it is that each month we're getting new releases, new approaches, new definitions, new changes, or we change some feature and put something new in there. So the problem is that it's always changing. And it's kind of hard to do a long-term project on that if you have new things, new approaches, and new libraries to do CI/CD, for example. So whenever I get a question about Fabric, one of the first one is always, would you recommend it for production use yet? And did you guys ever receive that kind of question too? Or do you wonder about that? Could I get a show of hands maybe? Perfect. So, did anybody of you answer, yes, we can do production on that and that will be okay? Could I get a show of hands for that? Thank you. So, we're going to talk about only CICD and what approaches we can take so that you guys can form your own opinion about it. And then later on, maybe you will be able to answer to that question in a different way than you wanted to before this prediction. Or maybe not. So, let's talk about the timeline that I mentioned. So, the call for papers, so the point where I submitted the session, was on 14th of December last year, so about 6 months ago. And I had a plan for the session, I had it laid out, and then we had 6 more months of development. And at the end of January, there was the introduction of Fabric CICD library, which is a library developed by a different team, Microsoft, than Fabric Proto Group. just for the purpose of deploying Fabric objects there. Then, 2 months later, we got a Terraform provider that went GA, so we could deploy some of the resources in Fabric through Terraform. And people started wondering, could we use that maybe? And then, a day later at, I think it was at FabCon probably, it was variable libraries and Fabric CLI, which are another 2 different tools that are supposed to either help with CICD or replace another tool that was used before, or Fabric's API that people used also in the pipelines. So in the last 6 months, that is the interesting part, we had 3 major changes to the whole CI/CD process. How it can be done, how it should be done, what is recommended by Microsoft also changed. So the problem is that if you had started the project in December and you decided on some approach and then you went 3 months forward, the recommended approach would be completely different and would have new fancy features that you would like to implement, but you already decided on that. And that is one of the biggest problems with Fabric at the moment. It's really changing every month. So it would be really nice to have this open view of that, see how it changes over time, and then decide based on that what we want to do there, how do we want to approach it, how do we want to structure Fabric so that we are kind of open to those changes in the future. Okay, so once we talked about the timeline, are there any questions right now? No. Okay, so the first approach is the simplest one. Those are the deployment pipelines. They are really easy to use. You basically create them. You have a simple GUI that you click 2, 3, 4 stages, and then on top of that you assign them workspaces and then you migrate the changes. What is kind of fun about this? You don't have the problem that you have with other tools. You don't have to set up the agents, runners, you don't have to carry about the security of that. You just have a feature in Fabric that you can use and deploy, and yeah, it works, kind of. And after that, there are still limitations, of course. So first, you need to have premium workspaces. If you have Fabric capacity, that takes care of that, but other than that, you need premium. Then one of the security issues that people have with those is that you need an admin to create it, and then you can share it with users. But the problem is that if you do dev, test, and prod stages, then a given user can deploy to test and prod whenever he or she wishes, which is kind of non-optimal if you have some standardized deployment process. Then, fun thing about it is that it allows for selective deployments, so that you can choose which objects from which workspace you deploy to the next one. But the problem is that there are dependencies. So basically, if, for example, your data pipeline works based on a notebook or calls other things in a Fabric, you need to deploy them together, because otherwise it will just show you an error that it cannot deploy without its dependencies. Okay, that's it, I think, for the intro. And then the biggest question when you move code, objects, whatever, between environments is how do we change certain things like connections, strings, parameters? How do we change it between environments so that it works correctly? And the deployment pipelines have some, let's say, problems with that. There's something called deployment rules that you can apply, but you can see this wonderful table on the right, which is from Microsoft documentation from yesterday, which shows where you can actually use it. So you can see that Power BI things are pretty well covered. But then if you think about notebooks, data pipelines, all this data engineering stuff, then you start hitting some other issues. And there are some other ways to deal with that, of course. But the problem is that then you have a deployment rule, for example, for a data mart or a semantic model or anything else really here. And then in data pipelines, you have to parameterize it another way. So you have 2 sources of truth for your parameters for different environments. And that will cause you issues later on when you have something working in production for an extended period of time. There is a wonderful video from Data Factory team that's linked here. So if you guys want to watch it later, then I really recommend it. It shows how to use the variable libraries to kind of solve it. And it seems like Microsoft is going this way, that those variable libraries will solve it in the future. But right now, they are only usable in data pipelines, so there's that. Okay, so if we go to the next one, we have we have things missing, basically. So usually, when you start a DevOps process, when you want to do a CI/CD pipeline, especially in bigger companies, you will have security team telling you, hey, we need to scan it with SonarQube. Or you will have another team telling you, hey, we need approvals because the QA team needs to approve their releases to QA. And those things are simply not there. And kind of not possible to really implement also in there. So the problem is that if you hook up a workspace to a deployment pipeline, you won't really be able to hook it up to another. So if you deploy dev to test, then you also have to deploy to prod because you won't be able to have a second deployment pipeline for that workspace. Which is a problem because there are no approvals. You grant access to a person to the whole pipeline, so that person can deploy it whenever she wants. So the next thing missing are quality gates. So what happens when you want to do a linting on your code or build it, run tests or whatever else after pull request or during the deployment. So you can implement that as pull request checks, of course, but then during the deployment, usually you want to run your test suites or scanning or anything else that your company might require to see if your code is okay. And here it will be really, really hard to do so. You can implement it on the side, but it won't be part of the deployment pipeline itself. So the question after that that arises, can we actually use that? So can we work with that? Is it okay? Is it suitable for small companies, for enterprises, and so on? And I hope by the end of this lecture, all of you will be able to form your own opinion about that. So the problems that I see, at least, is that the sources of truth for your environments are separated and are not in the same place. And then what can we do to fight with that, or what will Microsoft do to fight with that? So at the moment, what was released about a month ago, it was variable libraries, and right now they are supported in only one resource. But the next step, for example, are notebooks, and then probably another resources. So hopefully that will help with the issue of different places with different parameters. Okay, and we'll dive deeper, I think, now. Yep. So we'll do a short demo of deployment pipelines, and we'll take a look how they work, what we can do, what we cannot do, and so on. Have any questions arrived at this moment? Nope. No. Okay. So let me share my screen. Oh, great. Yeah.
So the question is, which of the deployment scenarios for Fabric components using the DevOps approach turned out to be the most effective in practice in terms of balancing, automation, and flexibility of environment configuration?
I was attending that question from the start, so thank you. We will cover that, I think, throughout the whole session, and I think you will clearly see what my opinion is. But I'm also a fan of doing CI/CD pipelines as CI/CD pipelines, not this simplified GUI version. So that will be my opinion, that currently Fabric CICD, as you will later see, it's also at the moment recommended by Microsoft to use Fabric CICD library for deployments. And the simple answer is because it allows for scripted deployment. So you can deploy it from your DevOps, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, Jenkins, or whatever other tool you use. You can use that library and then do the deployments. So you're not limited to what Microsoft decides to do in their deployment pipelines. You can do your own scripting, scanning, linting, whatever you desire. So
thank you. And we have another one.
Oh, nice.
So the second question is, what are the key considerations and tooling choices when implementing CI/CD pipelines for deploying Fabric components across multiple environments?
But multiple environments like development, test, production, right? Or multi-tenant, like you have multiple customers?
Hard to say, because this is not my question.
Okay.
But I think the first option.
Okay. 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 Let's say we'll cover that during the session, and then if that person is not satisfied, if the question could be asked again. Because I would like to show a short demo of that, and maybe that will answer some of those questions. Okay, we have that, yep. There we go. Okay, so it's not easiest for me to do it from the desktop. Just a second. Perfect. So, sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so here we are in a Fabric workspace that I called the test one. So let's assume this is our test environment. And what we have here is a data pipeline that uses a notebook. Then we have a second notebook, we have a variable library, and we have a test lakehouse just for the last of it. So those things we would like to deploy to a new environment. So if we go and create a new workspace, so basically, let's say I created already this one, which is a completely empty, fresh prod workspace. And we would like to set deployment pipelines for that. So what we do is we can go to here, click on deployment pipelines, a new pipeline, and let's call it a prod deploy. So the setup is really, really easy. So you can see that you have a basic flow of 3 stages, but if you need more, you can of course add them or delete them as you prefer. The only limitation I see here is that you cannot deploy in parallel. So you can see all of those deployments are sequential and based from the previous one. So if you would have the multi-tenant setup, then that would pose a problem that you would have, let's say, 3 clients with 3 production workspaces. Then that would be a problem because you would have to deploy each one of them sequentially. You couldn't deploy to all of them at once or choose to which one you deploy. So for the purpose of this demo, we'll have only 2 environments, let's say test and production, and then we just go to create and continue. And we just mark which workspace is the first one and which is the second one. And as you can see, one of the fun things about those are the limitations. So for example, that the lake houses are not covered under this deployment model. And yeah. And now you can see that it checks for the differences. And the important question right now is test workspace, as I can show you here. Okay. So the test workspace is hooked up under a Git repository that I created before this session. So first question I would have for you, what do you think if this changes here? So this change between test and production, is it shown based on the workspace state or the Git repository state? Yes, sadly it's about workspace. So you can have a situation here when you actually change something manually on the workspace. It's not yet submitted to Git, but with this deployment it will go to production if you're not careful. So you have to really watch out what you're deploying, and the GUI doesn't really help you understand what kind of changes are deploying. So the issue here is that you know that you're deploying notebook 2, but you don't know what kind of changes happened in notebook 2 since you last deployed it. So it will show you differences, and let's say that I want to deploy just the notebook 2, which is here. And of course, it should work correctly. So it will deploy the notebook, even change the workspace default and so on. So it will work okay. Then, if I want to go back and let's say deploy the data pipeline that I mentioned that is connected to the notebook, when you try to deploy it, it will show you that it cannot even start the deployment because the dependencies are not there. So this is also something that you need to watch out in the workspaces, and this is also an argument for keeping the workspaces kind of simple. So don't try to do the whole data flow in a single workspace because you're going to have problems later on of this kind on the deployment side and on the dependency side. So it's kind of easier to, for example, do the ingestion and transformation on the workspace, and then once you load it into a Power BI report, do that on the separate workspace so the deployments are separated for them, and you don't have this dependency problem. So, but if I of course go with the data pipeline and the notebook, it will of course deploy successfully, and that's okay. Okay, and then after we deploy that, there's this one thing that usually when you have a CICD from Microsoft, they do really well with inserts and updates and kind of forget about deletes. So what do you think, does it handle deletes? And if so, how it's done? Okay, then maybe a show of hands. Who thinks that if I delete something from test, it will reflect that on production? Can I get a show of hands for that? Okay, and who thinks that if I delete something from test, it will break production? Great, you were right. So it doesn't handle deletes. So the funny issue is that if you do something like this, so if you go to test, of course. If you go to test and let's say decide to delete notebook 2, here, then your deployment pipeline will just show an error there and won't allow you to do any action based on that. So what you will see is that it's not in source, which is kind of confusing because source usually refers to version control and so on, but basically it won't do anything. So if you decide to delete, if you decide on this approach and decide to delete anything on the workspace, you will kind of have to do it manually on all the levels, on all the environments that you have currently. And that is kind of an issue because we don't want people manually deleting things from production, for example. Okay. Another thing is the logging. So usually when you have a DevOps tool like Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, you have a pretty straightforward control of which version of code was deployed, and you can go to a git commit, see the code version, and so on. Here it's not really like this. In the logs, you will basically see that there was a deployment, and then it may show you a list of resources that were deployed in that instance. But it won't show you the changes that were done, or what changed, how it changed, was it code deletion, was it inserting new cells, and so on. So basically it will just show you on a file level that it was a change. Either it got created or updated, but that's about it. So the problem with that is that if, let's say, after a month, somebody will come to you and say, hey, what happened during that deployment? We think something went wrong. You won't really be able to check that. You will be able to check that, hey, we deployed like 5 things, but you won't be able to see what exactly changed, what might be the cause of the issue, and it will be a lot of manual labor to get to that. Okay, I think that's it for the demo. So let's move on with, are there any questions to the pipelines demo right now? Nothing, okay. Okay, so another thing that was announced recently are variable libraries. So basically something like a variable group from Azure DevOps, for example. So a central place in a workspace that you could put variables in and define them and put their values in there. And then use them in, for example, data pipelines as sources of connections, sources of passwords, or anything else that is per environment. But right now it's only supported in data pipelines. During FabCon it was also shown in notebooks, but that is not released yet, and it's coming in the coming months. So I hope we'll see it again. Then the biggest issue I see with that, right now you can save them to a Git repository. And the second thing, there is no option to mark them as secrets. So they're always saved as a plain text in your Git repository, which can be kind of problematic if you want to keep any passwords or connection strings or anything that shouldn't be really kept in your repos. So this can be used at the moment, but as a means of configuration, for example, a connection ID that you want to use on a given environment, but not really as, for example, a token to a system or anything like that, because it will be a plain text in your repository later on. Okay. And yeah, let's create a variable library. Let's see how it works and how we can use that. So if we go back to our test workspace, And yeah, I don't know if you noticed that, but every time I click on a test workspace, it sometimes goes to prod, which is just the Fabric GUI issue, but yeah. So if we create a new variable group, oh, sorry, variable library, we give it a name, library, and we'll get a pop-up asking us to provide some new variables into it. And let's call our variable test, and then we can define the type, of course, and the value set. So what is a value set? It's just a value for a given variable. And then why do we have that? So that you can define different value sets and enable them on different environments. So for example, I will have a default value set that's for development. So let's say that our variable will have value dev. And then I will add a new value set for production, which means I will have value prod here, for example, for our variable. So if a data pipeline, so ADF pipeline, would call this variable library, it would go to the test variable and then get one of those values depending on which workspace we're in. How it works is kind of, a bit manual at the moment. So once we deploy them, once we define them and deploy them to the workspace, and if we go to the test workspace, we will see that there is a test variable library. So let's go and try to deploy that. And yeah, every time you're going to end up here, it will try to reload the sources. So to reload the changes that happened since the last deployment. And we have the test variable library. Oh yeah? Zoom in. Okay, yeah, let me try that. Just a second. Is that better? Does the chat think so too? Okay. Okay, so let's try again. I hope, yeah, that should be okay. So let's try to deploy it one more time. So if we deploy the test variable library to production, it will of course work okay. But there is a but always. So once this is deployed, okay, we can go to our prod workspace. There we go. And what I meant that there is some manual labor. On each environment, you will have to set it up to use a different value set. So you can use the default one for development, for example, but then when you go to production, you need to set it as active on the production workspace, right? So that it will know which value set to use. Right now, there's no way of parameterizing that or configuring it on a workspace name basis or anything else. You just need to set it up manually per workspace that you're deploying to. And there's a question to you. If we go to the deployment pipeline, will this change show in the deployment pipeline? That you change something manually and it needs to be redeployed. Okay, who thinks it will show on the deployment pipeline? By a show of hands. Okay, who thinks it won't show on the deployment pipeline? Ha, great, you're right. So this is one thing they did correctly here, that the deployment pipelines don't see this as a change in the variable library. So if we go to here and refresh it as usual, then it won't show that the test variable library has changed, even though we did a manual change on it. Because for a good reason, this is excluded from here. So that's one of the cool things, that you can actually set it once and then don't really worry about that because it should work further on. Okay, so that's it for our demo. Okay, another nice topic that I found on one of, oh yeah, go on. No, that they actually implemented it in a good way. So you can deploy the test variable library again, and it will keep that production default value set on production. So that won't change. Anything else? No? Oh yeah, please just ask them because it's kind of hard to see because of the light. Oh yeah, if you want to. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the funny. That's what I mentioned, but forgot to show. That's a good point. Thank you. So if you go, one thing to correct, you only have Git on the lowest environment. You don't usually do for test and prod. You of course can, but what Microsoft recommends is usually having it just on the lowest environment. So if I go to Git and commit this, and then I decide to go to that repository, which I have here. So you can see that there's our test variable library, and you have value sets, and then you have production, and it clearly states what the value is. So that's one of the, oh, sorry, again, I did that again. So yeah, so you can see that the production is in a plain text in your repository. So what you need to watch out for, because in Azure DevOps, for example, you have a similar feature, but you could mark the value as secret, and then it's not saved. You cannot really recover it after that. So the users can use that in the pipelines, but cannot really know the value. But here, it's all in the plain text on your repository. So you need to be kind of careful to not put any passwords there at the moment, or connection strings, or tokens, or anything else that is not supposed to be publicly available in your project, company, or whoever has access to your repo. But yeah, the current problem that I see here is that you don't have an option to just hide it from repository. Okay, do you have any other questions? No? Okay. So let's go to presentation. Okay, so one of the fun articles I found on Microsoft blog was by yet another team in Microsoft talking about how to optimize your workspaces, your Fabric setup, so that it's easier to work with CICD. And in all of those slides, there's a disclaimer on the bottom, and that's the link to the article. I really recommend reading that later on. But the main points I will try to summarize for you. So one of the ideas they presented was that you shouldn't do stuff like we did that on Azure, basically. So usually we would go to a resource group in Azure, create storage, ADF, Databricks, signups, whatever else we need, and put that in one single resource group and use it from there, because those resources could be deployed independently of each other. But we don't have that situation anymore here. So what they recommended was that doing workspaces per, let's say, a topic of the workspace. So you would have a workspace for storing data, then you have a workspace for integration, then for orchestration, then for reports, for semantic models, and so on, so that different parts of Fabric would be in different workspaces. And yes, that's per environment. So what they suggested is, for example, you would have 6 workspaces on dev, 6 on test, 6 on prod, which is a kind of a different approach to what is usually done on Azure. From what I would recommend is that don't really think about this 6 number, just think about what makes sense for your project. So if you have, for example, a data loading, it might make sense to separate that from data storage or from Power BI reports. Because remember that when you grant access in a workspace, you grant it to all the resources inside. And usually in larger companies, you have this separation, for example, for data engineers and Power BI developers. And it's a good security practice to basically separate those so that they don't have access to each other. They can't really make mistakes on different resources that are not really their job to do. So what you can do here, you can just think in your projects if it makes sense. You can have 2 workspaces, you can have 3, you can have 17, if that makes sense on your case. So don't think of it as you need to have 6 workspaces, just think of it as you should separate your different topics of your project in workspaces. Then the next part that we are going to cover on the demo is pull request flow. So how can we work with Git integrated workspaces, how we should work with them, and how to do that easily. So a good thing is that when you connect a workspace in Fabric to a Git repository, it automatically loads the resources from a given branch that you connected. So what you can do is create a feature branch, create a new workspace, connect it, And then you have a development playground for you, which also plays really well with what we had on the previous slide. So you can see that we have one store workspace and one, let's say, integration. So when you're developing a new integration pipeline, you could do that on your development data together with other people, but then you would have your own workspace with your own pipelines so that it wouldn't be disturbed by work of other people, right? And then after that, after creating that feature request, you of course develop your changes, and then it's the usual. So you merge you commit the changes, you create a pull request, then you merge the pull request, and then it gets somehow deployed to your workspaces. And interesting thing from that article is that this team from Microsoft, which was yet another team, their recommendation was to use the Python library, not the deployment pipelines. So because that allows for scripted deployments. So you could put all your quality gates or your approvals or your security scans in the DevOps pipeline together with the deployment to make it more robust. And if you have like 10 to 15 minutes, please do read that article. It's really nice, it's very well written, and has some really nice pointers that I haven't had the time to cover here. But we will go and quickly cover the development flow, unless there are any questions at this moment. No, okay. Okay, so first we need to create our workspace, right? So let's do this in a simplest way. So we can create a new feature workspace. And then we need to connect it to our branch. So what we can do is to connect our AAD account, and keep in mind it needs to be the same account that you have on Azure DevOps, the same Entra account, so that they can be connected together. And then it's pretty simple. As with any tool on Azure Connected, you can create different feature branches from here. So what you can do is create feature branch, let's say feature 2, and create it from main. And then this is the important part, so the Git folder. Recently, it was introduced that you can create folders in Git and have your workspace stuff deployed inside of such a folder, so that if you have, for example, 20 workspaces, they can all be in a single Git repository, just in different folders, right? So here you have test workspace, and this is the code from our test workspace from here. Okay, sorry, I have to click that again. Okay. And the good news about that is, one, you have to type that properly, because if you don't, then that creates some kind of problems, sadly. But if you do that correctly, then you will see that things from your source control are being loaded to the workspace. So that if you had data pipelines, notebooks, anything else on that branch, it will get loaded to the workspace automatically. So yeah, it will take, I think, a minute or two to sync everything. So now would be a good time for some questions if you have any. Yes, please do. Yeah, you can just scream if you prefer, but yeah, microphone works.
I'll use the mic. So that you creating the workspace separately and then feature branch, but have you been experimenting with the option to branch out to a new workspace and create it at the same time? There is this option.
Yes, that's a great question. Yes,
I tried and it fails each time.
Yeah. In this article I mentioned previously, they have a very nicely worded sentence saying that they experimented with branching out to different workspaces, but it wasn't up to their standards, so they decided to create workspaces on their own. So yes, there is that option, but another argument I have against that is that in like 2 slides I'm going to show you Terraform for Fabric, and one good thing that Terraform does on Fabric is setting up workspaces. And another topic is that what I read in the community forums is that people have issues that when you have a larger company, larger user base for Fabric, and you give them the right to create workspaces and assign capacities, those capacities might be used on production, for example. So if you connect that to your development workspace, use that capacity, then production stops working. and that's not a good thing. So that's why I'm going to show you Terraform, because I think it's a nice thing to do a small self-service on Terraform to create workspaces so that you can assure that they are connected to the correct capacities and there is correct setup. And yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. And sorry, there was a second question. Yes. To the feature branch, which is branched from, yes, exactly. Feature branch. Because the test workspace, you can see that in the workspace settings always, right? So the test workspace is connected to the main branch, right? But you can always change that. And the new feature workspace is connected to the feature branch, so that you can develop your things, leave them be, and other developers don't really have either access to that, or they shouldn't just work on your stuff, right? So you have your separate little sandbox to work on your feature, and then you can merge it to the main code base. So yeah, let's try adding, are there any other questions? No? Okay. So let's try adding a notebook of any kind, really. It's going to be called notebook 3, great. And then let's see that it's on our source control, perfect. So it's any kind of object, whatever you developed, and then you're going to commit that. And you're going to see on your DevOps, if you go to your repository, there will be this nice pop-up to create a pull request. And then after creating the pull request, you're going to approve it and merge it. So this operation here deletes our feature branch and merges the code to our main branch. So now the question to you, do you think that will be reflected on the test workspace that is connected to this main branch? And who thinks that it will be reflected? Sorry? Okay, yes, exactly. So the problem with that is that you have your main branch, but it doesn't have to be in sync with your workspace. So if we go back to our test workspace, you will see in source control that you have updates. So basically that this notebook was added and you need to update it in some way. You can either do that manually, you can of course do that by a CICD deployment that we'll show in a second. Okay, are there any questions to that part? Yeah, please do. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's say that you had a notebook that had a shortcut into the lakehouse.
Yeah.
So is it now connected to the new lakehouse that you just created, or the old one, and we need to switch
to the old one? Sadly, that's true. There is one case when this actually works in deployment pipelines, when you have a data pipeline connected to a notebook on a workspace. If you deploy them together, the connection is going to change to the new workspace. But on other cases, lakehouses are not supported in deployment pipelines, for example. So sadly, it's the old one, so you have to have a way of changing that somehow. Okay, so we went through that part. So let's go back to the slides. So the next part is Terraform for Fabric. It was about a month ago that it was announced in GA, so version 1.0, and it has about 30 resources that it deploys. So authentication is pretty simple. There are additional steps during the setup, which is kind of a headache if you work in a bigger company and you have tickets for that. But other than that, it's a normal service principle that you can authenticate, and you do that both locally and through your CI/CD pipeline. And since we are a bit rushed of time, and I really want to show you this, then yeah, let's talk about the resources there. So what is very well supported are currently workspaces, Git integration, and capacity and access assignments. So the creation of workspace, this base level, you can automate with Terraform. And in the current roadmap, there are also things like firewalls on a workspace level or private endpoints on a workspace level, which could be also a good idea to deploy through Terraform so that you actually can monitor what is deployed. What doesn't work as well as I would have hoped are, for example, Lakehouse, SQL database, warehouse, and all the other data objects, for example, because the only parameters you will find there are name and description. That's it. You can deploy the object, but nothing inside of the object. Connections are currently not supported, so that's a bummer. And then you can deploy objects like notebooks or pipelines, which is basically JSON files or Python notebooks. But if they have dependencies and those dependencies are missing, the Terraform is going to fail, of course. If you have, let's say, if you want to call a prod connection instead of test one, then you need to change that before you do the deployment, or you need to make sure that your connection is there, because otherwise it will cause issues for you. And I think the next one is the demo. Yep, nope, there we go. So let's talk a bit about this. So, of course, this is too small. Nope. Tak?
One more question.
Yeah.
Speaking of Terraform, which components would you treat more as Fabric infrastructure and manage through Terraform deployment, and which artifacts would you leave for application like CICD?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the answer for me is pretty simple. Right now, workspaces are really well supported, and you can deploy them. And you can also do a small self-service for developers. So just do a JSON file with, a developer name or developer group or something like that. When the developer can come in, add 2 lines of JSON, and then the automatic deployment will deploy him a feature workspace with capacity assigned, with Git integrated, and all of this stuff. So it will be also faster for the developer. And thanks to that, you will have a single source of truth for your workspaces. Because in every project, after some time, you accumulate new things that are created for POCs, MVPs, whatever, that are short-lived, but somebody forgot to delete them. And if you do that through a configuration file and Terraform, you can actually have some suggestions which workspaces do you actually need, and which workspaces are just nice to haves, or somebody forgot about them and they are not used anymore, and probably we can just delete them. Here's the simple Terraform code I wanted to show. It's really, really simple, and I put it on Word so that I can make it bigger. So basically you can see that at the top you have Fabric Workspace that has a display name, description, and capacity assigned. And then you have 2 resources for capacities. The first one lists the capacities that you have in your Fabric environment, and the second one is just a reference to the capacity that you want to use. So you can use that, and if you decide to do that, then basically that will deploy your workspace. So is there any way to make this bigger? There we go. So the first thing is that you log in with AZ login with some additional parameters. You need to have your tenant ID, and that's about it. And once you do that, you will be ported to the usual authentication window, and then you're logged in. So we can start working with our Terraform. So the first thing, of course, Terraform init, that's how it always works, because you need to download the libraries and providers and so on. But after that, you can go for Terraform plan. And what that will do, it will show you what it's planning to deploy, what changes it's trying to do. So Terraform has this nice feature that will also keep your environment up to date. So if somebody changes one of the capacities manually, it will also show you that this capacity was changed and try to correct that. So it will try to assign your previous capacity back to the workspace. So even if you have some drift in your infrastructure, Terraform will try to help with that. So as you can see, it shows that it will create one workspace with name example1 and with a trial capacity assigned. So if we go for Terraform apply with auto approve, it will try to deploy this to your Fabric instance. And yeah, I think it will take about a couple of seconds. And of course, because it's Terraform, you can always automate that to be based on a pull request. So you can have a developer add a piece of configuration, and once this is committed to the repo, it will create a feature workspace for the developer. So they don't need to do that manually and remember which workspace to use, what's the naming convention, what's the Git repository to be used. It will just be created for them this way. So here it should be, there we go. So we have workspace called example1 created by our Terraform. And if we go to the workspace settings, it will already be, it will already have the correct license. So my wonderful trial license assigned. And yeah, so to answer the initial question here, we can use Terraform here. And this way you can control what kind of workspaces you have and which of them actually should be there and are not just some kind of POCs that were forgotten about. So that's the only thing I see Terraform right now that would be good use of this tool in Fabric. Okay, are there any questions at this point? No? Okay, so let's move back because we have one last tool and one last demo to do. So yes, the Fabric CICD. So this is a Python library that allows you to deploy the resources from Fabric, like notebooks, data pipelines, reports, everything, to your workspace in a programmatic way. So basically by writing a piece of Python and running that somewhere. So why is it so hugely cheered right now in the community? Because it allows you to use different DevOps tools, like Azure DevOps, like GitHub Actions, like anything else that is currently a standard in our profession. So right now, this is open sourced and maintained by a team in Microsoft that developed that. And this is also a kind of funny story because they developed that because they are working on Fabric and needed an easier way to deploy things. So that's why they wrote a new library for that. Authentication works the same way as with Terraform before. You just need a service principal that has an access, and then you can deploy the objects. And then what is good about it, you use it in a normal DevOps tool. So you can basically deploy it however the way you want to, and also not everything at once. So it allows for some parameterization at the moment. It contains a simple find replace function. So if you just need to change some parameters from test to prod, like a name or something, you can do that with this. And then if you need to change like a connection string or parameter or anything like that, you can also do that with that function. So you can have one place when you decide which parameters go to production and how it's deployed. Then, because we do that through the script, we can add whatever our DevOps tool supports. So if we want approvals, then we can add that. If we want testing, we can run them as a next step in the pipeline. If we want security scanning, we can also add them. And the same goes for approvals, for example. And then whatever our native tool, our native features of the tool are, we can add that to the pipeline now. We are not limited to what is in the deployment pipeline. So let's go and let's show how it works currently. I stole the code from a wonderful guy called Kevin Chant, which is also linked in the slides. So please go visit he has a really nice blog covering Fabric and really nice articles there. So let's go to our repository. Nope. There we go. So yes, so we have a sample pipeline here. So I know that you might not be used to DevOps pipelines in general, but those are pretty simple steps that you install Python, that you install PowerShell libraries, then you authenticate. So basically you get a token from Fabric to do the authentication. And then there's the last task of using the Python script that we have. And this Python script is also extremely simple. It's arguments and parameterization and so on, but the whole deployment happens in here. So you can see that you have a target workspace object that you create. You have a workspace ID, so the target workspace that you want to deploy to. You have environment, you have repository directory, which means the folder that you want to deploy to. And then you have item type in scope, which is kind of interesting because you can limit what kind of items are deployed. So if you want to have a separate pipeline to deploy just data pipelines from the workspace, now you can do that with this. So you can limit only to deploying the data pipelines and notebooks, for example. So you won't deploy reports or other things. So after that, after this one definition, we have those 2 lines of code, and that publishes our changes to the target workspace. And basically, it works really really simple once you set it up. I have a workspace called CICD sample, with just notebook 1. So let's say I will just delete that for now. Oh. And yeah, let's go to DevOps, and I will try to run the pipeline. And as you can see, I'm just running it for the main branch. Okay, so at this point, do we have any questions? Nope. Great. Do we have anything from the chat? No? Also great. Okay, so this is going to run for another minute. So let's go to our wonderful summary. So as you know, there's a lot of unclear opinions about how to deploy things in Fabric. And basically what I wanted to give you is my current opinion, and you can of course agree or disagree with that. But what I see right now is that if you have a smaller project or just doing a POC or anything simple really, you can just go for deployment pipelines and deploy it this way. Because for simple things it will work. For a small report or anything like that, the drawback of that is that you won't have all these DevOps additions there. So you won't have approvals, you won't have code scanning, you won't have automated tests or anything like that. And debugging will be hard for you. So that's one of the issues here. Then, if you want to have, let's say, some standards introduced, that your company requires you to include some scanning tools, to run test suites, to add approval gates so that, for example, the QA team will release to test, and then let's say product owner release to prod, then for that you need a normal DevOps tool like Azure DevOps, for example. And that then you can include those in the pipeline. And yeah, so currently my recommendation when I'm starting a new project would be to go with the Fabric CICD library and utilize that in your current DevOps tool of use. So basically if you use DevOps, if you use GitHub Actions, if you use Jenkins, you can use that and include that library in there for the deployment. One question I sometimes get is, could we use the API of Fabric to do the deployments in a script? Of course you could. I wouldn't recommend it. So the problem with that is the API is really dynamically changing. And if you think that the changes that we have on features are happening often, then API is changing more frequently. So you'll have a lot of maintenance to do basically because of that. So you can of course hardcode to a version of the API and keep it that way. But then once you come back to that project, let's say 3 months later, half a year later, it will have some issues because of it. So you can. I personally wouldn't recommend it, especially that now we have tools that are starting to emerge for that. And the last things, I would treat workspaces just the way we treat infra in Azure. So something that is set up maybe not centrally, but from one place, and that everybody is clear how to set them up. So that when you have a new developer, you have a simple process to create workspaces for them and allow them to work. Not something that they have to dig through how to do accesses, how to do Git integration, oh my god, I need to do a private endpoint. None of that stuff, because you can automate that with Terraform basically. And that's the place I see for Terraform at the moment, to set up the workspace without any objects inside, and then the objects are managed by your Git integration and your, of course, development of new features. And that's about it, I think. I don't know if there are any questions from the room at the moment, because yeah?
Using Fabric CICD, would you still recommend or follow the recommendation from Microsoft of having only the main or master branch on the lower environment, or in this case have branches?
I would recommend having 2 branches, because you can have, let's say, develop and main, right? And then you use develop for develop, and once you merge to main, and whichever Git flow you decide to use, that's up to you, but once you merge to main, it should trigger the deployment to, for example, test and prod, right? So usually what I see in project, it works better if you have 2 branches that are separated.
Last question, because we are running out of time, but last question from the chat. Do you know good resources to learn more about automated testing in Power BI.
Yes, there is the blog. So if you go back a few slides, there we go. I don't know if you can see it here, but at the bottom of this is a name, kevinchant.com. So basically Kevin Chant is a really great guy who writes a lot about Fabric lately. And he also has articles about automating test pipelines and how to do testing on Fabric, for example, and how to include them in your DevOps pipeline. Okay, and one last thing, just wanted to see if that finished. Oh, it's still running. Okay, so do we have any other questions? Okay, then I think that's it. Thank you for being here with me. And yeah? I'm sorry, I don't hear you. Mm-hmm. Yes. It deploys the incremental changes, yeah. Does that answer or? Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah, as with everything Fabric, this library is also updated like every 2 weeks. So there are new things coming to Fabric, then the library needs like a few weeks to adjust to that. And of course, it is open source, so we can all try to contribute if needed. Okay, do we have anything else?
Do you know if it's available, Fabric CICD for premium workspaces?
What do you mean, is it available?
Yeah, so is it available there for?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes. Because it just uses Fabric API for the deployment, so it's not really limited to the capacity that you have. And there was a question here. Yes. Yeah, because merge conflicts are not supported by Git by default, right? So you can have a plugin in the tool that you use, for example, in DevOps. There's a plugin for like graphically solving merge conflicts. So you can see that this piece of code is conflicting with this one, and then you can like change the code to adjust. But usually it's a plugin, both for DevOps and for GitHub Actions, as far as I know. Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, we need to finish, sorry about that. So, thank you for being here with me, and hope you are going to enjoy